Well, hello there, and welcome to the Cory Doctorow podcast. I'm Cory Doctorow, and it's lovely to be talking to you again after an unbelievably busy week. I think I recorded the podcast last week on the weekend because I knew that the week would just be too busy, and boy, was it ever. So, first, I went to this Tory think tank policy exchange, they're called, down in Westminster to debate copyright reform with someone from the British Phonographic Institute, just like the RIAA, and a guy from Universal who's actually quite a nice guy. And on my side were me and Jim Killick, who's the new executive director of the Open Rights Group. As well, there was the theoretically neutral head of the Committee on Media, Sport, and Culture, who in fact was pretty much not very neutral and pretty much on the other side. I think we actually we covered ourselves with a fair bit of glory. It was pretty funny that the most substantial thing the guy from the BPI could come up with to say, and over again he repeated it, was that he thought we were too flamboyant in our rhetoric, or that we were too, it was too much hyperbole. I wanted at one point to say, like, are we here to do literary criticism or to discuss substantive policy issues related to copyright? And then a couple days later, I went up to Milton Keynes, the celebrated and often bemoaned new town of Milton Keynes, to give a lecture. And when I was done, they surprised me by asking me if I would become a visiting senior lecturer. So I am now a visiting senior lecturer at Open University here in the UK. And apparently, there's an honorary degree that comes with it in 2011. So I finally have a university degree, which is pretty handy. Um, and then on Saturday, I went to the Convention on Modern Liberty, the London Convention on Modern Liberty. All across the UK, there were essentially giant town hall meetings, every one of them sold out with people standing around outside trying to get in to talk about the question of liberty in Britain. And I was on the closing panel of the one in London, along with Billy Bragg and some folks from English Pen and some other musicians and so on. And it went really well. Billy Bragg turns out to be just an excellent and really thoughtful guy, and who had some really good substantive comments to make. They videoed it, so I'm hoping it'll go up soon. And then I also sat in on a kids panel on kids and civil liberties, which is an issue I'm increasingly interested in. And that was a fantastic panel. I tweeted it. Those of you who are on Twitter, you might follow me. Doctorow is my login. And if you look at the tag COML in my Twitter stream or in general, Convention of Modern Liberty, you'll find lots of notes from it. Unfortunately, there was a vaccination kook on the panel who wanted to talk about how it was a child's right not to be given autism by having measles vaccinations, which thoroughly discredited unscientific notion, and who, like all kooks, just kind of nattered on. But yeah, apart from that, it was quite good. I also wrote two short stories last week on commissions. One, Constitutional Crisis, was for an educational project here in the UK on the future of the book, and it takes the form of a set of bylaws for a guild of gamers in a virtual world who gradually become organized criminals, and whose bylaws, and the story of that is told through amendments to their bylaws. And then the other one was called Ghosts in My Head, and I wrote that for Discover magazine for Ellen Datlow, and the commission was to write 1,000 words on on a scientific discovery that rocks the world, and it's a story about the scientific discovery of how to perfect um, the process whereby people simulate people in their heads. I didn't explain that very well, but imagine that if you can hear the voice of your dead grandparents in your head when you go off to do something wrong, or when you do something that you're very proud of, you can imagine that there's a kind of little simulation of that person, a representation of that dead person in the back of your head, or indeed a living person. You might hear your father's voice, your mother's voice telling you to make the bed if you leave the apartment with the bed unmade. It's a story about the perfection of causing people to create simulations of people in their head, and how that destroys everything from advertising to warfare to copyright to narrative. This week is a little slower, though not much. I'm headed off to Milan on Thursday for their Meet the Media Guru event, where I'm going to be speaking. And I'm not sure exactly what all I'm doing there, but I've gotten a little bit of an inkling. I've just prepared my talk for there. Um, I'm going to have the problem I always have when I go abroad to give talks, which is that as you can hear, I'm a very fast talker. When I was at the UN for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, I was definitely the bane of the simultaneous translation corps. And even when I think I'm going slow, I'm going way too fast. So I'm just going to have to slow it down. And the week after, thankfully, is going to be a lot slower. The only thing that's going to make it slightly busier is Alice is going off to South by Southwest in Texas. Please say hi to her if you see her. Which means I'm going to be home alone with the baby, who is just a delight these days. She's walking, she's giggling, she's playing peekaboo, she's playing jokes. She laughs her head off all the time. And she started to very actively throw her food, which is, I guess, something we're less happy with. But apart from that, boy, is she ever fun. On the writing side, For the Win, the novel I'm working on, has just hit 45,000 words. And HarperCollins UK, my publisher here in Britain, has bought the rights to Makers, my next novel, the one that's coming out in October. Some of you read part of it syndicated on Salon under the title Theme Punks. So Makers is going to be published simultaneously in the US by Tor and in the UK by HarperCollins. They've also bought the entire backlist of novels. So Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, Eastern Standard Tribe, and this book I'm reading to you now, Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town, all to be brought out here in the UK. And when my foreign rights agent called me to tell me this, he pointed out that in the interim he'd sold the rights to Little Brother in 10 languages. Let me see if I can bring those up for you now. Here we go. So it's been sold in 10 languages: Greek, Russian, French, Norwegian, Croatian, Dutch, is Hebrew, Italian, Korean, and Vietnamese. So there's editions coming out in all those languages and a couple more on the back burner that he's got hopes for. If you're a British publisher and listening to this and thinking, boy, I really missed the boat there, my short story collections are still available. Just a little idea there in case you're wishing that you had something that you too could option. Anyway, that's enough boasting. It's been a really good week, and there's a couple of really good weeks coming up, even if they are a little on the busy side. And now I'm going to podcast you a little more of my 2005 novel, Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town. Kurt and Alan examined every gap between every storefront on Augusta, no matter how narrow. Kurt kept silent as Alan fished his arm up to the shoulder along miniature alleyways that were just wide enough to accommodate the rain gutters depending from the roof. They found the alley that Frederick had been dragged down near the end of the block, between a mattress store and an egg wholesaler. It was narrow enough that they had to traverse it sideways, but there at the entrance were two smears of skin and blood, just above the ground, stretching off into the sulphurous, rotty egg depths of the alleyway. They slid along the alley's length, headed for the gloom of the back. Something skittered away from Alan's shoe, and he bent down, but couldn't see it. He ran his hands along the ground and the walls, and they came back with a rime of dried blood and a single strand of long, oily hair stuck to them. He wiped his palms off on the bricks. "I can't see," he said. "Here," Kurt said, handing him a miniature maglite whose handle was corrugated by hundreds of tooth marks. Alan saw that he was intense, watching. Alan twisted the light on. "Thanks," he said, and Kurt smiled at him, seemed a little taller. Alan looked again. There on the ground was a sharpened black tooth, pierced by a piece of pipe cleaner wire. He pocketed the tooth before Kurt saw it, and delved farther, approaching the alley's end, which was carpeted with a hummus of moldering cardboard, leaves, and road turds blown or washed there. He kicked it aside as best as he could, then crouched down to examine the sewer grating beneath. The greenish brass screws that anchored it to the ground had sharp cuts in their old grooves, where they had been recently removed. He rattled the grating, which was about half a meter square, and then slipped his multi-tool out of his belt holster. He flipped out the Phillips driver and went to work on the screws, unconsciously putting Kurt's flashlight in his mouth, his front teeth finding purchase in the dents that Kurt's own had left there. He realized with a brief shudder that Kurt had probably used this flashlight while nipple-deep in the dumpsters, had an image of Kurt transferring it from his gloved hands to his mouth and then back again as he dug through bags of kitchen and toilet waste, looking for discarded technology. But the metal was cool and clean against his teeth, and so he bit down and worked the four screws loose, worked his fingers into the mossy slots in the grate, lifted it out, and set it to one side. He shone the light down the hole and found another finger bone, the tip of a thumb, desiccated to the size of a large raisin, and he pocketed that too. There was a lot of blood here, and a little puddle that was still wet in the crusted middle. Frederick's blood. He stepped over the grating and shone the light back down the hole, inviting Kurt to have a look. "That's where they went," he said, as Kurt bent down. "That hole?" "That hole," he said. "Is that blood?" "That's blood." It's not easy to fit someone my brother's size down a hole like that. He set the grate back, screwed it into place, and passed the torch back to Kurt. Let's get out of here, he said. On the street, Alan looked at his blood and moss-grimed palms. Kurt pushed back his floppy, frizzed-out, bleach-white mohawk and scratched vigorously at the downy brown fuzz growing on the sides of his skull. You think I'm a nut, Alan said. It's okay, that's natural. Kurt smiled sheepishly. If it's any consolation, I think you're a harmless nut, okay? I like you. You don't have to believe me so long as you don't get in my way, Alan said. But it's easier if you believe me. Easier to do what? Oh, to get along, Alan said. Davy leapt down from a rock outcropping as Alan made his way home that night, landing on his back. Alan stumbled and dropped his school bag. He grabbed at the choking arm around his neck, then dropped to his knees as Davy bounced a fist-sized stone off his head, right over his ear. He slammed himself back, pinning Davy between himself and the sharp stones on the walkway up to the cave entrance, then mashed backwards with his elbows, his head ringing like a gong from the stone's blow. His left elbow connected with Davy's solar plexus, and the arm around his throat went slack. He climbed to his knees and looked Davy in the face. He was blue and gasping, but Alan couldn't work up a lot of sympathy for him, as he reached up to the side of his head and felt the goose egg welling there. His fingertips came back with a few strands of hair blood glued to them. He'd been in a few schoolyard scraps, and this was always the moment when a teacher intervened. One combatant pinned the other atop him. What could you do after this? If he was going to take the rock from Davy's hand and smash him in the face with it? Was he going to take the rock from Davy's hand and smash him in the face with it, knocking out his teeth, breaking his nose, blacking his eyes? Could he get off Davy without getting back into the fight? He pinned Davy's shoulders under his knees and took him by the chin with one hand. You can't do this, Danny, he said, looking into his hazel eyes, which had gone green as they did when he was angry. Do what? Spy on me. Try to hurt me. Try to hurt my friends. Tease me all the time. You can't do it, okay? I'll stab you in your sleep, Andy. I'll break your fingers with a brick. I'll poke your eyes out with a fork. He was fizzing like a baking soda volcano, saliva slicking his cheeks and nostrils and chin, his eyes rolling. Alan felt helplessness settle onto him, weighing down his limbs. How could he let him go? What else could he do? Was he going to have to sit on Davy's shoulders until they were both old men? Please, Davy, I'm sorry about what I said. I just can't bring her home, you understand, he said. Pervert! She's a slut and you're a pervert. I'll tear her titties off. Don't, Danny, please don't. Stop, okay? Darren bared his teeth and growled, jerking his head forward and snapping at Alan's crotch, heedless of the painful thuds his head made when it hit the ground after each lunge. Alan waited to see if he would tire himself out, but when it was clear that he would not tire, Alan waited for his head to thud to the ground and then, abruptly, popped him in the chin, leapt off of him and turned him on his belly and wrenched him to his knees, twisting one arm behind his back and pulling his head back by the hair. He brought Davy to his feet under his control before he'd recovered from the punch. I'm telling Dad, he said in Davy's ear, and began to frog march him through the cave mouth and down into the lake in the middle of the mountain. He didn't even slow down when they reached the smooth shore of the lake, just pushed on, sloshing in up to his chest, Davy's head barely above the water. He won't stop, Alan said, to the winds, to the water, to the vaulted ceiling, to the scurrying retreat of the goblin. I think he'll kill me if he goes on. He's torturing me. You've seen it. Look at him. Davy was thrashing in the water, his face swollen and bloody, his eyes rattling like dried peas in a maraca. Alan's fingers, still buried in Davy's shiny blonde hair, kept brushing up against the swollen bruises there, getting bigger by the moment. I'll fucking kill you! Davy howled, screaming incoherent into the echo that came back from his call. Shh, Alan said. Shh, listen. Davy, please, shh. Davy's roar did not abate. Alan thought that he could hear the whispers and groans of their father in the wind, but he couldn't make it out. Please, shh, he said, gathering Davy in a hug that pinned his arms to his side, putting his lips up against Davy's ear, holding him still. Shh, he said, and Davy stopped twitching against him, stopped his terrible roar, and they listened. At first the sound was barely audible, a soughing through the tunnels, but gradually the echoes chased each other round the great cavern and across the still, dark surface of the lake, and then a voice, elusive as a face in the clouds. "My boys," the voice said, their father said, "my sons, David, Allen, you must not fight like this." Davy began, and the echoes of his outburst scattered their father's voice. "Shh," Allen said again. "Daniel, you must love your brother. He loves you. I love you. Trust him. He won't hurt you. I won't let you come to any harm. I love you, son." Allen felt Danny tremble in his arms, and he was trembling too, from the icy cold of the lake, and from the voice and the words and the love that echoed from every surface. "Adam, my son, keep your brother safe. You need each other. Don't be impatient or angry with him. Give him love." "I will," Allen said, and he relaxed his arms so that he was holding Danny in a hug and not a pinion. Danny relaxed back into him. "I love you, Dad," he said, and they trudged out of the water, out into the last warmth of the day's sun, to dry out on the slope of the mountainside, green grass under their bodies and wispy clouds in the sky that they watched until the sun went out. Marcy followed him home a week before the Christmas break. He didn't notice her at first. She was cunning, and followed his boot prints in the snow. A blizzard had blown up halfway through the school day, and by the time the class let out there was fresh, knee-deep powder, and he had to lift each foot high to hike through it, the shush of his snow pants and the huff of his breath, the only sounds on that icy winter evening. She followed the deep prints of his boots on the fresh snow, stalking him like he stalked rabbits in the woods. When he happened to turn around at the cave mouth, he spotted her yellow snowsuit, struggling up the mountainside, barely visible in the twilight. He'd never seen an intruder on the mountain. The dirt trail that led up to the cave branched off a side road on the edge of town, and it was too rocky even for the dirt bike kids. He stood at the cave mouth, torn by indecision. He wanted to keep walking, head away farther uphill, away from his family's den, but now that she'd seen him and waved to him, his cold, numb face drained of blood and his bladder hammered insistently at him, he hiked down the mountain to meet her. "Why are you here?" he said, once he was close enough to see her pale, freckled face. "Why do you think?" she said. "I followed you home. Where do you live, Alan? Why can't I even just see where you live?" He felt tears prick at his eyes. "You just can't! I can't bring you home!" "You hate me, don't you?" she said, her hands balling up into mittened fists. "That's it! I don't hate you, Marcy. I love you," he said, surprising himself. She punched him hard in the arm. "Shut up!" She kissed his cheek with her cold, dry lips, and the huff of her breath thawed his skin, making it tingle. "Where do you live, Alan?" He sucked air so cold it burned his lungs. "Come with me." He took her mittened hand and trudged up to the cave mouth. They entered the summer cave, where the family spent its time in the warm months, now mostly empty save for some straw and a few scattered bits of clothing and toys. He led her through the cave, his eyes adjusting to the gloom, back to the right-angle bend behind a stalactite baffle, toward the sulphur reek of the hot spring on whose shores the family spent its winters. "It gets dark," he said. "I'll get you a light once we're inside." Her hand squeezed tighter, and she said nothing. It grew darker and darker as he pushed into the cave, helping her up the gentle incline of the cave floor. He saw well in the dark, the whole family did, but he understood that for her this was a blind voyage. They stepped out into the sulphur spring cavern, the acoustics of their breathing changed by the long, flat hollow. In the dark he saw Edward Frederick George playing with his matchbox cars in one corner. Davy leaned up against their mother, sucking his thumb. Billy was nowhere in sight, probably hiding out in his room. He would, of course, have foreseen this visit. He put her hand against the cave wall, then said, "Wait here." He let go of her and walked quickly to the heap of winter coats and boots in the corner and dug through them for the flashlight he used to do his homework by. It was a hand crank number, and as he squeezed it to life and pointed it at Marcy, her face wan and scared in its light, he gave the flashlight a few more pumps to get its flywheel really spinning, then passed it to her. Just keep squeezing it, he said. It doesn't need batteries. He took her hand again. It was limp. You can put your things on the pile, he said, pointing to the coats and boots. He was already shucking his hat and mittens and boots and snow pants and coat, his skin flushed with the warm vapors coming off the sulfur spring. You live here? She said. The light from the flashlight was dimming, and he reached over and gave it a couple squeezes, then handed it back to her. I live here. It's complicated. Davy's eyes were open, and he was staring at them with squinted eyes and a frown. Where are your parents? She said. It's complicated, he said again, as though that explained everything. This is my secret. No one else knows it. Edward Frederick George tottered over to them with an armload of toy cars, which he mutely offered to Marcy, smiling a drooly smile. Alan patted him on the head and knelt down. I don't think Marcy wants to play cars, okay? Ed nodded solemnly and went back to the edge of the pool and began running his cars through the nearby scalding water. Marcy reached out a hand ahead of her in the weak light, looked at the crazy shadows it cast on the distant walls. How can you live here? It's a cave, Alan. How can you live in a cave? You get used to it, Alan said. I can't explain it all, and the parts that I can explain you wouldn't believe. But you've been to my home now, Marcy. I've shown you where I live. Davy approached them, a beatific smile on his angelic face. This is my brother Daniel, Alan said, the one I told you about. You're his slut, Davy said. He was still smiling. Do you touch his Peter? Alan flinched, suppressing a desire to smack Davy, but Marcy just knelt down and looked him in the eye. Nope, she said. Are you always this horrible to strangers? Yes, Davy said cheerfully. I hate you, and I hate him. He cocked his head Alanward. And you're all motherfuckers. But we're not wee horrible shits, Danny, she said. We're not filthy-mouthed brats who can't keep a civil tongue. Davy snapped his head back and then forward, trying to get her in the bridge of the nose, a favorite tactic of his, but she was too fast for him and ducked it, so that he stumbled and fell to his knees. Your mother's going to be very cross when she finds out how you've been acting. You'll be lucky if you get any Christmas prezzies, she said, as he struggled to his feet. He swung a punch at her groin, and she caught his wrist and then hoisted him to his tiptoes by his arm, then lifted him off the floor, bringing his face up level with hers. Stop it, she said. Now! He fell silent and narrowed his eyes as he dangled there, thinking about this. Then he spat in her face. Marcy shook her head slowly as the gob of spit slid down her eyebrow and over her cheek. Then she spat back, nailing him square in the tip of his nose. She set him down and wiped her face with a glove. Davy started toward her, and she lifted a hand, and he flinched back and then ran back behind their mother, hiding in her tangle of wires and hoses. Marcy gave the flashlight a series of hard cranks that splashed light across the washing machine, and then turned to Alan. That's your brother? Alan nodded. Well then, I see why you didn't want me to come home with you. I think that's enough. It's time for my lunch. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you in about another week.